Jim Elzinga is an internationally recognized mountain climber who works with industrial organizations to improve their safety performance. His passion is helping everyone he works with achieve a zero-injury, zero-incident safety standard. Getting to the top of a mountain is optional. Getting down is mandatory.
This quote is by Ed Visters, one of America's greatest mountain climbers. It means that climbers must be willing to abandon the effort to reach the summit if it threatens their ability to get back down. To stay alive, climbers must be truly committed to this concept. It shows up in every decision they make, every action they take, and I like to refer to this as living it. It is not easy for a climber to be willing to turn around and descend when the goal is in sight and it seems so easily achievable. At this point in a climb, there seems to be some type of invisible force pulling us onwards that grows stronger the closer we get to the top. But to stay safe, climbers must resist this temptation and turn back when an unsafe situation develops. In the workplace, workers can experience a similar force that tempts them to take a shortcut to make a job go faster or easier. But to stay safe, workers must also resist the temptation and be willing to not do a job the quickest or the easiest way, but instead do the job in the safest way. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad you're here. My name is Jim Elzinga, and I've been climbing and pursuing outdoor adventure for over 40 years. Along the way, I've learned many lessons about what it takes to stay alive in hazardous environments. And you may be surprised at how well my experience in the world of mountain climbing applies to staying healthy and alive in your world, here in the workplace and beyond. Reaching the top is not my definition of success on the mountain. For me, success also means getting everyone to the bottom again, safe and alive. This must also be the goal at your facility, to return everyone home safely at the end of each shift. This may seem simple, but when faced with everyday pressures and challenges, this commitment can fade and people die. That was certainly the case on my first expedition to Mount Everest in 1982. On my first expedition to Everest, I was a member of a very large national expedition. The stated goal and the primary focus was to place a Canadian on top of Mount Everest for the first time in history. I later learned this was not the goal we should have been focused on. The problem was what lay between base camp and Camp 1, the Khumbu Icefall. The icefall is a huge glacier that moves at a rate of over 3 feet or about 1 meter a day. Because the glacier is constantly flowing down the mountain, it can open up huge crevasses, causing large towers of ice to fall over without warning. Because of the hazardous, unpredictable, and uncontrollable conditions in icefall, it's not uncommon for people to be killed while climbing through it. So why go that way? For some, traversing the icefall is a rite of passage and a tribute to earlier climbers like Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, who had passed through before them. And the vast majority of climbers end up here because it's simply the way it's always been done. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Well, I can tell you in mountain climbing and here in your workplace, blindly following tradition and doing it the way that it's always been done is not necessarily the best way to deal with hazards or unsafe conditions. Unfortunately, like many expeditions before and after us, the leadership of our 1982 expedition to Mount Everest chose to take on the Khumbu Icefall. Our plan for the icefall was to send lead climbers in to establish anchors into the ice and snow and lay a trail of secure, fixed lines so subsequent climbers could clip onto the fixed line and ascend safely. To cross the crevasses, we lashed together long aluminum ladders and anchored them on either side of the crevasse. We would then install a fixed line across the crevasse so that climbers could cross the ladder safely. These fixed lines and ladders were part of our plan to ascend the icefall. We thought we were being safe. We had no idea what was to come. Another part of our safety plan was our communication protocol. This was a set procedure in which lead climbers at higher elevations would inform those lower down of the weather conditions and the avalanche hazard. The protocol that everyone was familiar with was that this report would be delivered by radio at 3 a.m. each morning. For the climbers at base camp, this would determine if it was safe to enter the icefall and begin carrying loads from base camp to Camp 1. Good communication is a key element of any safety plan. When communication breaks down, people can easily assume they know how best to proceed and that all hazards are controlled. Making assumptions about safety often results in injuries or fatalities. During this time, our team leader, Bill, was part of a group of climbers who were installing the anchors and fixed lines along the route to Camp 2. This was exhausting work, and Bill was very fatigued and wasn't acclimatizing well to the altitude. That evening, Bill decided to change the radio call to base camp from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. so he could sleep in. Another climber, Dave, thought this was a bad idea and offered to get up at 3 a.m. and make the call. Bill bluntly refused the offer, telling Dave that only he, the team leader, could make the call and that he would make it at 5 a.m. Making safety decisions under physical or mental duress can lead to a serious incident. In our case, Dave recognized the potential problem and tried to speak up, but the leadership culture of our expedition didn't allow for the input of other team members. That night, unknown to the climbers at base camp, it snowed over 3 feet, 1 meter at Camp 1. This created extreme avalanche hazard on the slopes just above the icefall. Unfortunately, back at base camp, when no radio call was received at 3 a.m., the climbers assumed that it was safe to proceed. For the climbers and the Sherpas at base camp, it was business as usual, and they began ascending the icefall. The fact that the base camp climbers were willing to proceed, assuming someone had received the radio report, is a sign of a breakdown in leadership and safety culture. Similar breakdowns occur in workplaces when safety procedures are skipped and workers make assumptions about their safety. Back up the mountain at 5 a.m., just as Bill was making the radio call to base camp, there was a loud boom, and all the new snow broke off the steep face of the mountain, forming an avalanche a half a mile wide and heading towards the icefall at nearly 200 miles per hour. At base camp, I was awoken by the roar of the onrushing avalanche and rushed out of my tent where I saw this huge white wall as high and wide as I could see, just storming out of the sky and into the icefall. It was literally blasting tons of ice and snow out of the way like a runaway freight train. When it all settled, we realized that a massive avalanche had come down into the icefall and had rolled right over the climbers and the Sherpas. To this day, I still get angry about this because I know those climbers would not have been there but for the breakdown of our safety protocols and the culture of poor leadership that had taken hold in our expedition. After a frantic rescue effort, it was determined that the avalanche had killed 3 Sherpa climbers. The Sherpas are the indigenous people who live in the Mount Everest region. We were only able to recover 1 body. To this day, the other 2 Sherpas remain buried under tons of snow and ice. We were able to carry the 1 body down to the nearby village called Dougla, which lies in the shadow of Mount Everest, where the families of the Sherpas had gathered to perform their cremation ceremonies. On our return from Douglas, I led a small group of climbers back into the icefall to relay the anchors and fix lines and repair the broken ladders to re-establish the route to Camp 1. After finally reaching Camp 1, we were resting and reflecting on the tragic events when I decided to radio down to base camp to check in. That's when I got the shocking news that a large section of the icefall had collapsed and had killed my friend and teammate, Blair Griffiths. We didn't know what to do. We checked in with our team leader, Bill, and he said we were to leave Blair's body half buried under the ice and to continue to push up the mountain towards the summit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When Bill later decided to address the safety concerns with the group as a whole, he said, "Everest is cold and hard, and if more people die, we're going to leave them there and keep marching up the mountain." That was a breaking point for some of the climbers, and several left the expedition right then and there. I decided to sleep on it and stay another night. I had invested 3 years of my life in the expedition, and I didn't want to give up on it too easily. When I awoke the next morning and tried to make sense of everything that happened, I kept coming back to safety and leadership. I realized that safety must be a core value that is held equally by everybody, especially by leadership. I concluded that trust in leadership could be damaged beyond repair when leadership blindly dismisses individual concerns and reaching a goal is deemed more important than the well-being of individuals. Once I recognized the brokenness of our current situation, I knew I had no choice but to walk away. Over half the expedition joined me in the walking away from what we saw as an unsafe situation. The remaining climbers continued up the mountain, and 2 Canadians, supported by 3 Sherpas, eventually reached the summit, making the expedition a success in the eyes of its leadership and to the casual observer. And what I learned, and what I hope you now understand, is that by achieving a goal, by putting others' lives at risk, should not be considered success. This is why I always refer to the 1982 expedition as a failure. I was so affected that I felt compelled to return to the mountain and bring with me a new approach to climbing. I knew that a return expedition to Mount Everest must have a fundamental goal of bringing everyone back alive, and that to do this, safety would have to be held as the highest value by all team members and leaders. So you can see there are strong similarities between my inspiration to achieve a culture of safety in a climbing expedition and an organization's inspiration to achieve a culture of safety in the workplace. And it takes all of us to make it happen. Whether you're in management, you're an experienced worker, or the newest employee. Take the lessons learned from our failed expedition and apply them to your daily work. In order to prevent injuries, we need to understand the relationship between hazard and risk. For example, an unstable snowfield on a remote mountain slope or an unguarded machine in an empty workplace are hazards, but neither one of them presents any risk until a climber makes his way onto the slope below or a worker enters the work area near the machine. Because of this relationship between hazard and risk, I knew that I needed to separate climbers from the exposure to the hazards of the mountain. Your organization uses the same concept to reduce risk and prevent injuries here in your workplace. A well-designed safety program uses safe work procedures, machine guarding, protective equipment, and other measures to separate workers from exposure to hazards, thus reducing risk. To understand and manage risk, you need to understand a little bit about human nature. People do not take risks unless there is something to be gained from it. I would not have been climbing all those mountains for the last 4 decades if I did not get something from it. The problem with this is that people can become so focused on the potential payoffs of the risk that they lose all perspective of the potential loss. For example, many climbers die on Mount Everest when they become so fixated on reaching the summit that they lose all perspective of the dangers around them. Many exhausted and dehydrated climbers press on well past the point of any reasonable chance to survive the effort, only to die of oxygen deprivation and exposure as they get near the summit or on their way back down. One section of the mountain near the summit is so littered with bodies dressed in brightly colored climbing gear that everyone calls it the Rainbow Valley. This is an example from my world of a very skewed weighing of the potential gain against the potential cost of risk. You might think these climbers are crazy to press on like that, and I certainly don't condone it, but I can at least understand it because I know about the years and years of hard work and training and planning that goes into a once-in-a-lifetime attempt to reach the top of Mount Everest. What I can't understand are the chances some of you are willing to take here on your job. And just like climbers, I find that workers frequently overinflate the benefit they might derive from a risky action, and they consistently underestimate the potential loss that might occur. In reality, the potential gain from skipping a safety procedure can only be a few minutes of time, or maybe working for a moment without wearing uncomfortable protective gear. But the potential cost in money from lost time, or the pain from injury, or the impact to your family if you are killed, is huge. It's almost immeasurable. If you are one of the ones taking risks like this, you really need to stop and rethink what you are doing, because you clearly have a very skewed perspective of risk and reward and the value of your own health and life. As for me, I was performing the same exact type of risk assessments. Remembering the 4 deaths that occurred in '82, I simply could not find a way to reduce the risk of climbing through the Khumbu Icefall to an acceptable level. So I came up with the only solution possible, and that was also compatible with our core safety values of our expedition. We would climb the mountain from the other side, from Tibet, bypassing the icefall together. And doing this would be attempting to ascend the mountain on a route that had never been climbed before. I encourage each of you and your management teams to also be willing to think in terms of alternatives to the way things have always been done, and seek out new ways of doing things that will reduce risk. This is a creative way of embracing your responsibility for your own safety and the safety of everyone you work with, that could take your facility's safety standard to a whole new level. So just to give you an idea of our planned route, from base camp, we'd climb up to the site of Camp 1, which was at 19,000 feet. From there, we plan to move our supplies across the mountain, then up 1,000 vertical feet to establish Camp 2 at 20,000 feet. Using Camp 2 as a high altitude advanced base camp, we would push on up the mountain to Camp 3 and then establish Camp 4 at 24,000 feet. The most logistically challenging part of the expedition would be establishing Camp 5. This would require carrying equipment and supplies from Camp 4 over a 1.5-mile traverse to the site of Camp 5, which would be established at just over 25,500 feet. We found it really helpful to focus on this plan and on establishing each camp one at a time. And this is exactly what I would encourage you and your organization to do. Establish some milestones, some measurable steps that each worker and each department can focus on as steps towards the larger goal. Each organization is different, but some examples could be to achieve a certain number of housekeeping inspections each month, or a certain number of job safety observations per worker. Perhaps each department would set a goal for 100% PPE compliance, or performing a certain number of job safety audits each quarter. Remember, stepping onto the pinnacle of a mountain is only possible because of the many hard-fought steps previously taken by each individual team member, most of whom will never get the opportunity to reach the summit. These team members believe 100% in the plan to reach the summit and embrace their individual roles in making it happen. Organizations who achieve a world-class safety culture have employees who believe 100% that reaching the pinnacle of safety is achieved in the same way that reaching the pinnacle of Mount Everest is. One step at a time, taken by individuals working towards a common goal. In theory, every climber on our expedition had a chance to be chosen for the summit bid, but ultimately it came down to who was performing the best and who was also the healthiest. Dwayne Collington and Sharon Wood were selected to be chosen for the summit bid. Of course, there is no guarantee that Dwayne or Sharon would get to the summit. There are 1,000 things that could stop the ascent and mandate turning back, but the guarantee they did have was that they would get the best resources we had left and have the benefit of everyone's precious effort to support their summit bid. Dwayne and Sharon descended down to base camp to rest up, while the rest of the team went back up the mountain, making sure everything was in place for the summit bid. Once everything was in place, Dwayne and Sharon, along with 3 support climbers, made their way up to Camp 5 at 25,500 feet and began assembling the supplies they needed for their summit bid. This is when Sharon discovered that there were several fuel canisters missing, which means that she and Dwayne would not have enough fuel to melt snow for drinking water. This is a major problem because at these altitudes and conditions, dehydrated climber can quickly become a dead climber. Sharon immediately recognized the danger of the situation and radioed down that the summit bid should be called off. This was a huge decision for her because she was posed to become the first woman from the Western Hemisphere to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Sharon was truly living it by making a decision that her and Dwayne's safety were more important than her personal ambitions. And I'm telling you again, this is not an easy choice to make. And it's also the type of choice each one of you must be willing to make in similar circumstances. When unsafe conditions develop while performing your job, you must be able to stop the work until the conditions are corrected. That's living it. While Sharon was on the radio calling off the summit bid, we were all frantically digging in the snow, looking for the lost fuel canisters. Surprisingly, we found one fuel canister buried in a place where it had no business being. This one canister was just enough, so Sharon and Dwayne were back on track. To this day, I have no idea what happened to the missing fuel canisters or how that one canister ended up where it did. So the next morning, Dwayne, Sharon, 2 support climbers, and I climbed for over 10 hours to reach 26,800 feet and establish the final camp, Camp 6. Once we got them settled into the camp, the support climbers and I descended back to the lower camps, leaving Dwayne and Sharon alone at 26,800 feet on the north face of Mount Everest. Due to the volatile conditions, they were unable to leave Camp 6 the next morning until 9 a.m. and start climbing towards the summit, which was still more than 2,000 vertical feet above them at 29,029 feet. As they were climbing, we were in radio communication, and after several hours, we finally heard Sharon say, "We think we see the summit. We're almost there." But then we hear that it was a false summit, just a hump in the ridge they were climbing. And from there, it was one false summit after another. But they kept pressing on, one step at a time. And eventually, at 9 p.m., 12 hours after they first set out, we get word by radio that they are now standing on the summit of Mount Everest. Down below, we all celebrated our success in getting them to the top because we all had a part in achieving it. It took all our efforts, every one of us, to reach such a seemingly impossible goal. It's like that here at your organization also. Creating a safety culture where 0 injuries are possible can be achieved when each person lives it by putting safety into each choice and decision they make. Each day at work, there are hundreds of choices and decisions that must be made. Each one must be made with the worker's safety in mind. Many of these decisions may seem small to you at the time, like, am I going to inspect my tools before I use it? Or am I going to correct this tripping hazard?
Hey, Jesse!
But every decision is important,
Some safety glasses while
and the cumulative result of all these individual safety decisions becomes your organization's safety culture. We had reached the pinnacle of Mount Everest, and I was very proud of what we had done. We had successfully climbed a new route up Mount Everest. Sharon Wood became the first woman in the Western Hemisphere to reach the summit, and most importantly, we brought everyone back off the mountain safely. So what's next? Well, for me, I truly love climbing, and I continue to climb all over the world. And as I climb, you may be surprised to hear me say this, I'm not the youngest climber out there. In fact, I'm one of the oldest. And as an experienced climber, what I really enjoy is mentoring younger climbers. I teach them many of the same safety survival lessons I have shared with you today. You see, the safety culture we created on our Everest expedition didn't end with the final descent. It went home with all the climbers. And we have passed it down from older climbers to younger climbers, not only through words, but through our actions, by our example. The same can be true of your workplace or any workplace that has developed a successful safety culture. Once established, a safety culture can be passed down to the next generation by the words and deeds of experienced workers. And when that happens, when a zero-injury safety culture becomes self-sustaining because the workers value it enough to pass it down, that's when you know your organization has truly reached the pinnacle of safety. Thank you very much.
To contact Jim Elzinga for live keynote presentations and his safety culture change initiatives, call 416-619-5431 or email info@jimelzinga.com. You can follow his blog on issues related to leadership and safety culture at jimelzinga.blogspot.com.